Dr. Michelle Gordon, Senior Lecturer in the Department of African American Studies and Director of Undergraduate Studies, will demonstrate how to analyze a primary source using historical and interdisciplinary research methods. She will be using the Gossip Book from the Owen Dodson papers held here in the Rose Library.
Hi, I'm Dr. Michelle Gordon. I'm a Senior Lecturer in the Department of African American Studies and the Director of Undergraduate Studies there. So today I'm looking at some items from the Owen Dodson papers, and several of these are items I've never looked at before. So I will be talking in part about what do you do when you're in the archives and you encounter something new that is unfamiliar to you. So the first thing I'm looking at from this is Owen Dodson's personal recollections and view of the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance, or as I like to call it, the New Negro Renaissance, is one of the most famous of the African American cultural movements of the 20th century, and largely is understood to have taken place between the late 19-teens and the early 1930s. Owen Dodson was among the younger members of that Harlem Renaissance or New Negro scene in New York. And so part of what we have here in the Rose Library archives in his papers are a lot of his recollections of some of the major figures of the Harlem Renaissance, as well as major artists and writers who came after. We also have a lot of his correspondence, photographs, and some of his own writings. So let's start with this handwritten document called Harlem Renaissance, A Personal View. And I won't go through the whole thing, but certainly when you're in the archives and you're looking at a manuscript like this, especially one that's just about a dozen pages long, if you are in here researching, you should look at the whole thing. But sometimes you do have to make choices when you're in an archive and you don't have all the time in the world to go through all of the boxes, or you're working on a project just of a certain length or size. You do need to sometimes pick and choose what you're looking for. So what I picked and chose in terms of what I was looking for in the Owen Dodson papers, I chose to focus on some of his materials on the Harlem Renaissance. I'm really interested in his writings and his correspondence from other periods, but this does help me get some focus and not feel quite so overwhelmed as I'm looking at the archives. And remember, you can always come back. Taking photographs, if that's permissible, can also be a really great way to get through a good amount of material, perhaps more material than you could just in the appointment time that you have might allow. So this Harlem Renaissance, A Personal View, he tells us that the Harlem Renaissance didn't start at any given time, which is quite a provocative sort of thing to claim about a literary or cultural movement, or really any kind of movement. But I think he's pretty right. So one of the things that interests me in looking at this is when we go into the archives or when we're looking at personal accounts, recollections, eyewitness accounts of events or movements can really help us get different perspectives or different opinions or views on something. So very standard that scholars had once said that the Harlem Renaissance was basically just the 1920s and that it really started in 1925. But here we have Owen Dodson saying it didn't start at any given time. And in fact, if we look at this New Negro movement, the term New Negro has been used for a couple decades before this really starts, and that does help muddy the waters. So here is Owen Dodson. The very first thing he wants to tell me about his personal view of the Harlem Renaissance is that maybe we should question the established chronology of that movement that really says it's short, it was just in Harlem, and it was really less than 10 years. So this is an interesting document, sometimes hard to read. This is infamously one of the most challenging things about working in archives is reading people's handwriting. It's not terrible, but it's also not great. And he describes the kind of standard accepted narrative of where this New Negro Renaissance starts, which is with the publication of Elaine Locke's anthology, The New Negro, which appeared in 1925. But pretty early on, he tells us that Locke's view and his version of this movement really was just a particular and rather elite or elitist view. But he then goes on to tell us, why is this movement important? So right after he tells us that the Harlem Renaissance didn't start at any given time, he then goes pretty immediately into talking about what had been the established or understood beginning of this movement, which began, he says, many say it began when Elaine Locke published The New Negro in 1925. The Negro speaking for himself, to himself, his people, and to a dream. A volume of fiction, poetry, drama, music, essays on the past of our people, the pioneers, our institutions like Howard University, Hampton, Tuskegee, etc., the middle class, the West Indies, the paradox of color, Negro womanhood. Now, it's interesting to me, this is a pretty accurate description of that anthology. It is interesting to me that Negro womanhood is listed last, and it really is considered to be perhaps the least important or least attended to of all of these issues in the actual anthology. The anthology is over 400 pages. I think there are 6 women who are published among all of these writers. So this is an interesting and not clearly an unfinished and not totally formalized essay. He goes on to describe what he saw as the major ambitions or goals of this movement. And he also talks about that really there was not, prior to this moment, real cohesion. There wasn't a consistent sense of racial identity, of what Black culture meant to Black people or to America. There was not consensus, he points out, about Black push for freedom and how to get there. But he also says that this was this moment of incredible artistic production, of optimism, of believing that this is a moment that Black people really could make themselves into recognized American citizens and citizens of the world. One of the things that interests me if we go through this is that we can then really see some of the places where he's thinking through what does he think of the Harlem Renaissance or what's important. And he has notes to himself. So this is always one of the fun things when you're going through archives and you see how writers are scratching things out or leaving little notes to themselves or questions. So here he says, relate how Madam Walker got her money. Golden pipe organ, how she died. So he doesn't actually have that written up about Madam C.J. Walker in this document, but we can see where he wanted to go. So it's pretty clear, just a few pages in, that this is an incomplete essay. We start having a lot more notes of what he wants to do than a formal essay. This can be really useful and interesting in research for a number of reasons. One is the archive is very useful for going beyond what is published and what anybody who can access those books or magazines might be able to access. But it also really can give insight into a writer or a person or an organization's thought processes, their goals, and as well as their writing process or research process. So after we get some of the notes, he wants, for example, there is a note, describe the Dark Tower, Madam C.J. Walker, Alelia Walker, the villa, I don't know, the villa something christened by Caruso. I don't know what that means. So I would take note of that, for example, if this is something that I thought could be valuable to my research. I'd take note of that and go look up what it was. One of the things that's really useful and interesting in a document like this, even though it's not finished, are the number of people who are a part of this movement and this period, and particularly, but not only in Harlem. And so you really can get a sense through the archives about the networks and the connections among writers, artists, institutions, politicians, et cetera. And so one of my favorite things and one of the most valuable things to me in working in archives, looking at correspondence, looking at documents like this, is really mapping out who knew whom, whose ideas were influencing what or what groups, and how are ideas and how is culture traveling within a particular community or from community to community. So he's naming a number of people, many of whom, if you've studied the Harlem or New Negro Renaissance, would be familiar to you. Nella Larson, George Schuyler, Langston Hughes, James Weldon Johnson. And then he starts giving us some of the important places that were some of the sites of the movement. Again, if you've studied this period, some of this might be familiar to you. Small's Paradise, the Savoy Ballroom, the Cotton Club. And then we get to an interesting kind of messy bibliography, where he's thinking about what were some of the important writings to him that came out in this period. Nella Larson's Passing, for example, Jessie Fawcett's Plum Bun, There is Confusion. And these are interesting and important to me because, as I mentioned previously, often new Negro women have been left out of this picture. They weren't as recognized in the moment, and certainly for many decades after, the scholarship really disproportionately focused on men and marginalized women writers and artists. So it's very interesting to me to see that here, one of the members of this movement, one of the people who was a part of this, really is recognizing the importance of these texts. So this also can be a really valuable way to find some of the more marginalized or ignored or forgotten figures in any kind of movement or literary tradition, community organization, etc. He has a whole section here on setting down the blues, looking at how poetry was trying to draw on Black vernacular culture and popular culture. He's talking about the drama. Here it says drama : even the Lord was segregated. So really talking about that persistence of segregation in Black life, and also how that impacts and is treated in Black arts. Oh, we have here Richmond Barthé, who was an interesting visual artist. He talks about the sociology, the novels. This is really quite comprehensive. Entertainers. He talks about some of the important white patrons of this movement. We have an interesting little critique of the middle class here, just as middle class period, false values period. So after a number of pages of kind of notes and lists and bibliographies, it seems that Dodson has gathered his thoughts a little bit about what does all of that mean and what might they have had in common, given that there were so many different worldviews, experiences, ideas, and politics afoot in this movement. He says the men and women of the Harlem Renaissance did not make bitterness their big thrust. Theirs was always awareness of the indignities society thrust upon them. They wanted more to see and know the world before they began to fight it. In many ways, they sought some kind of joy and inquiry into themselves and brotherhood. Their theme song was not We Shall Overcome, which is, of course, the most famous song of the Civil Rights Movement, but Lift Every Voice and Sing by James Weldon Johnson, one of the leading figures of the New Negro Renaissance.